This is Author to Author, presented by Cornell University Press. This episode features Debra Bruno, author of A Hudson Valley Reckoning, and Susan Brewer, author of The Best Land. Come with them as they discuss how they uncovered the truth of their families' histories of racism, displacement, and slavery, as well as what they did with that truth.
Well, my name is Susan Brewer. My book is called The Best Land, 400 Years of Love and Betrayal on Oneida Territory. And it is about the land I grew up on in Oneida, New York, which my grandfather called the best land. And it is about the two families who've lived there over the past several hundred years. My family of European settlers and the Mohawk Oneida family of a woman named Polly Denny. And so it traces the story of Oneida dispossession through the story of these two families and the place they called home.
Great.
And so Debra.
Hi, my name is Debra Bruno, and my book is called A Hudson Valley Reckoning, Discovering the Forgotten History of Slaveholding in My Dutch American Family. And it is about the fact that my Dutch ancestors in the Hudson Valley of New York were enslavers, which I hadn't learned when I was growing up, so I was surprised to learn that. And my discovery of a friend, a woman who wrote the afterword to the book named Eleanor Meyer, whose family descended from the people my family enslaved. So the book is an exploration of the history of slavery in the Hudson Valley mixed in with memoir and personal stories of our discovery of our shared ancestry. So it was a fascinating dive into rabbit hole after rabbit hole.
Why? What compelled you to write it from the beginning?
That's the question that I think is the most important thing to the central to the book. The fact that I didn't know this and that I felt as if many people, even people who consider themselves well-educated in history, didn't know about Northern slavery very much, really meant to me that I could tell the story in a way that would be accessible to them. So because I am a journalist, my first instinct in learning a fact is to tell the story. So I felt that I had to tell the story of my family and the family of those my family enslaved, because their stories wouldn't be told otherwise. Nobody else was going to do it. How about you, Susan? Is that why did you write your book?
It's very similar. I grew up on our family farm in Oneida, New York, and I lived surrounded by my extended family. My grandparents lived next door. Aunts, uncles, and cousins came to visit. And I always associated the land with love and security. And then when I was in high school, the Oneida Indians claimed that New York State had acquired their land illegally, and they won their case in the courts. And that unsettled everything. And I remember having very conflicted feelings about this. I thought the Oneidas were probably right. And I also didn't want to lose our farm.
Right.
And so at the time, I had these questions similar to yours, which, why didn't I know anything about this and what actually happened here? And those questions would refused to go away, even over decades and decades. And so I finally said, all right, I will try to find out and answer these questions. And that's what led me to dig into this whole story of the land, the farm, and the people who lived there.
That's fascinating, because I think that whole question of questions not going away happened to me also, because when I grew up mostly as an Italian American, I thought of my Italian ancestry as the most dominant ancestry, and the one that I remember having ravioli at Christmas and feeling sorry for everyone who had turkey and ham at Christmas because that was so boring. So I didn't know anything about my Dutch ancestry except that they were farmers in the Hudson Valley, and plain people. And then when a friend said to me, oh, if your ancestry goes back to the 1600s, you had enslavers in your family. And I remember thinking, no, not me. We were poor. We were not, I was thinking of the big plantations of the South. And she said, well, just look. And what I did is manage to delay it by a few years, probably because I didn't want to know also. We lived in China for 3 years. And of course, that was a good excuse because then I didn't have to do the kind of research that I needed to do. And when I came back, I finally said, okay, I need to confront this. And I went online. I found the will of my 5 times great-grandfather, Isaac Collier, who in 1796 bequeathed his enslaved people to his children and grandchildren. And Collier was my grandmother's maiden name. And this was exactly the town I had grown up in, Coxsackie. And so I thought, okay, that tells me that this is just the tip of the iceberg. And it turned out it really was, because the more ancestors I looked for, the more enslavers I found. And that's when I went down the rabbit hole of finding out more and more about slavery, especially slavery in the Hudson Valley, which was so powerful. So, Susan, how hard was it for you to do this book? What was the research like?
The research was very challenging. And you know how difficult it is to trace families, family history going way back, and especially in my family and also in Polly's Mohawk Oneida family, very challenging to track down people. And then there's always missing pieces, and then you have, of course, a legacy of suppressing Native voices and Native history. And so trying to dig through what records we do have to get to that was very challenging. And it was really important to me to respect the Oneidas have an oral tradition of passing down their history from the elders. And, what I found is that in many ways their history was right. I mean, their land had been taken from them illegally, and the history that I had grown up reading in textbooks and local histories was not. So it's, even though I know that Americans and Europeans valued the written record more than oral tradition, I found that, the oral tradition carries a lot of validity. Both have to be questioned very closely, and you have to bring a lot of skepticism to it. But I think that was a big part of the challenge of doing the project, was just trying to answer the basic questions of what happened here. And then why didn't I know it, of course, is because so much of it is buried or hidden or suppressed or romanticized. I felt like, I don't know if you ran into this, but I felt like a lot of people, when you're writing about the indigenous inhabitants, felt a license that they could just make stuff up. And so you're kind of always questioning even what you do find. So I'm sure you found that too,
yes,
right?
Absolutely. Yes. For me, for enslaved people, of course, they didn't show up by family name until after emancipation for the most part. And then when they did have a family name, they often took the Dutch last name of their enslavers. So that meant that then I was finding people with the same exact name. Was John Vanderzee a white man or a black man? Sometimes it was very hard to tell. So that was a great deal of the problem. But I found that I had a great deal of trouble trying to look through records. I remember going through the archives of Vedder Research Library in Coxsackie, where I would just page through these pages of letters written during the Revolutionary War, where they would talk about shortages of butter and, the privations from the war. And every once in a while, there would be a reference to, oh, my slave is dying, by the way. Tell his mother that he probably won't make it. And I remember thinking it was between the lines. It was so hidden, and it was hidden in plain sight. But it was like looking for a needle in a haystack where you're not quite sure what the needle looks like. So I found that was both infuriating and also fascinating, because it made me more determined to try to put the pieces together. And I can't say that the book is a complete picture. It's a partial picture, because I don't know if there could be a complete picture of this story. And that's one of the things I found fascinating about your book, was just how complicated the removal of land was, and how many different ways that the native population were tricked and stolen and deceived out of that property that had belonged to them, that had been in their tradition for so long. That must have been very difficult to write also.
Yes, it's a painful story, and you're so right. Much of it did happen through paperwork. It wasn't it didn't contain the outright violence and policies of extermination that were used elsewhere. It was largely through corruption, deceit, negotiating treaties that were not enforced, or that were based on lies, lots of broken promises, and then just layers and layers of policy. And so you have this combination of the role of the federal government, the state government, which was instrumental in dispossessing the Oneidas, and then the role of land developers and canal developers and railroad developers, and then ordinary settlers like my family, who are determined also to get a land of their own, and are also violating the law by squatting on Oneida territory. So yeah, it is I think I was really impressed with how you put this together too, but there's a lot of layers and generations to explain. So even once you get your research done, which is never done and always incomplete, you have to organize it all and try to make sense of everything. And I was really impressed with how you did that and laid it out. I think that is a challenge that often goes unrecognized, about just how do you make sense of these pieces when you have so many missing parts too.
That was hard. And the thing too about it was that I wasn't doing a traditional academic book. And so the trajectory wasn't necessarily chronological. There was some chronology there, but I really felt very early on that I needed to talk about why I hadn't learned this. And I wanted to examine the literature. I wanted to look at James Fenimore Cooper and Washington Irving and some of the early writers of New York to see, did they make references that I just missed, or was it retreated with kind of a shrug? And so that was fascinating too, because I found some material that proved to me that even if it had been there, slavery had been referenced, it was referenced as if it was benign and short, and it was neither benign nor short. The numbers were smaller than the numbers in the South, but it wasn't benign at all. And so that was one of my biggest goals in doing the book, was to also ask what it is about our education system that is not allowing students, or is not exposing students to this history that is an important thing to think about. The North, I thought, were the Underground Railroad and the abolitionists and fighting for the Union during the Civil War, not this 200 years before that of enslavement and then a gradual manumission that was slow. So that was hard to tell.
I found something similar, where the discussion, when it shows up, of the Oneida Indians is often about the efforts of white people to civilize them over and over again, which, in whatever method they're using, usually results in them losing their land. So, wow. And I thought that, first of all, the Oneidas and the Haudenosaunee, the people of the Longhouse, who lived across New York State, had a very sophisticated system of politics and diplomacy and war making. And they, this idea that they were savages or uncivilized, is so misleading. But, it's just these layers of, like the kind of thing you're describing, where something really truly horrible and bad is happening, and yet it's presented in this sort of gentlemanly way of, we are, of New York State claiming to really try to help, the people whose land they are stealing. So I think that that's in part going toward the answer of why didn't we know anything about this, because it's sort of slipped under the rug all the time, right, or mentioned in passing, and you don't get the details that you cover about the horror of these families being separated, as children are sold or willed to someone else. And, that line in that letter, tell someone a beloved person has died, it's like, so the family is recognized as being divided. It is really breathtaking when you think about it.
These were on two sides of the Hudson too. So one was on the east side and one was on the west side of the Hudson. So it wasn't easy travel, and also, children who were born into the twilight period, what I call the twilight period of slavery in New York, where they were born between July 4th, 1799 and July 4th, 1827, were not enslaved, but they owed around 25 years of servitude. So they were bought and sold as if they were enslaved, and children could be taken from their parents as young as 3 or 4 years old and sent off to another family to become their servant. So it was just as nefarious as slavery was. And I found so many cases of children fighting to get back to their hometowns or being taken from their mothers, and their mothers then trying to get some justice for them. So you get a small inkling of what must have happened, and the inkling is only showing up in the paperwork. And I can only imagine, since there is lots of paperwork I haven't seen, that there are stories like that I've completely missed. I'm curious, because I think this is one of the things that we think about a lot, is what was the biggest surprise for you? I know you wanted to do this research for a long time, and it had called you, but when you finally started, did something hit you that you didn't know you would see?
Oh yes, I think the biggest surprise was that when I was tracing my family and Polly Denny's family, was I found that they had lived next door to each other for about 300 years. And so that was stunning, since I knew nothing about, these people, my family or her family. And I kept running into them over and over again. And like you, I had a wonderful assistance from a woman whose Oneida ancestors lived next door to mine, and she had done a lot of Oneida family history, and we were so. It took us so long to finally put that together, and partly is because I was taking the families and putting them on the land and saying, "Do you realize that they're next door to each other again? They are." And just that we would know nothing about this, that I think was the biggest surprise to me, that how connected our lives and history have been, and how we knew nothing about that. And I think that that's part of what you were talking about with that combination of darkness and joy in doing research like this, is that you're writing about something awful and grim and oftentimes vicious, and yet you experience this joy in doing this research and writing because of the connections you're making that really are, you're really bringing human beings together rather than dividing them and separating
Oh,
them. Does
yes,
does that fit with what your experience
absolutely.
has been?
Yes. And that's a wonderful way to put it, because I think you're right. This is such a tough subject to learn about and to read about and to hear the stories. And for me, for example, to find that one of my ancestors' children were actually, their throats were slit by an enslaved man in their household. And I had to think about what that meant, to imagine a slave having that level of sort of ability to kill sleeping babies. But at the same time, when I found, first of all, Mary Vanderzee, who is the matriarch of Eleanor's family and a woman who was living in the household of Conrad Hotelling, and I have Hotelling ancestry. And then to realize that she had a number of children, but I'm able to find the descendants of her first son, Thomas Hotelling, who was a boatman on the Hudson and who lived for many years in New Baltimore and in Kingston and in Saugerties. And he had a large family, and everyone I've met, and I've met dozens of Vanderzee descendants, all from Thomas. And it's just been wonderful. So there's been this sense of, there's been this sense of community and this sense of grace from the people of the Vanderzee family to welcome me, to call me cousin, and to say, that they don't blame me. They're appreciative that Eleanor and I have done the research, more than that I identify as the descendant of their people's enslavers. So it's a complicated and nuanced and messy story, but I've made some fantastic and unusual, only in America kinds of friendships as a result of this. So that was pretty funny.
Mm-hmm.
Susan, we should also mention that you and I share an ancestor.
That's right.
We are both
we are very distant cousins. Yes. Yes.
We both descend from Lambert van Valkenburg, the first van Valkenburg to settle in New Amsterdam, who then ended up in Fort Orange and Albany. So, and then his family spread out from there. Well, I don't know if you know that quite a few Van Valkenburgs were loyalists during the Revolutionary War and ended up in Canada and changed their names to things like Falkenberry and different names. I guess they didn't want to be associated with anything American anymore. So that was pretty fun.
I sympathize with you having to do research of Dutch ancestors, because even though it's very interesting and the Dutch colonial records are fascinating, it's also a challenge because people have 3 or 4 different names that they go by. You're dealing with people changing their names a lot. And in my family, sort of made a career out of moving closer and closer to the Mohawks and the Oneidas. And because they had learned native languages and served as sort of go-betweens, what's intriguing to me is they spoke a language called Mohawk Dutch, this sort of blended language, and they also had kinship ties to the Mohawks, which gave them access to land and security. And for them, the power and the influence of the Mohawks and the Oneidas was a path to opportunity, that they saw their service in a sense as go-betweens, as a way of maybe improving their lives, but they were also people living sort of on the edge of, I would say, both colonial society and the land of the Longhouse. So, the Dutch. I didn't know that. You knew that, because in the Hudson Valley, it's much less mysterious than when you get out on the edge. But I did not know that my family that included so many Dutch ancestors who arrived so early.
Yeah, the Dutch ancestry is fascinating. Yeah.
Yes, it is. It is fascinating. And also, I think it very much tends to be, like you wrote about this, very sanitized, with the tulip festivals and, the wooden shoes and, that stuff. When they were pretty ruthless colonizers. And, I do think that story is often also, I mean, that's that. It's not something you want to have a local festival about.
No.
I think that is in part why the history we look at tends to get buried too. It doesn't help you promote your town or make people feel good necessarily about where they live. And so I think it tends to be hidden for that reason as well.
I think that's probably true. It's interesting. New York State now is trying to create this Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad byway, and in some references to it, I've seen it being called a scenic byway. So, which seems to me a little bit of a romanticizing of what exactly are we talking about here?
This is where my friend Becky said you have to laugh or you cry, because that is just a scenic byway.
I think they actually dropped
Yes.
the word scenic though from the
Oh,
description.
I'm really glad. I, yes, yes. Well, and I think that's a classic thing in many places. People want to promote their hometown. They want to make it attractive, and that's understandable. It's just that doesn't have to come with burying the past or hiding the past or dismissing the past. And that came up a lot for me because, of course, many of the people I grew up with said that what happened long ago doesn't matter. And so treaties made long ago don't matter, or promises, guarantees don't matter. And the courts in recent years have upheld that by saying that if you address the dispossession illegally of the Oneidas, it's too disruptive to uphold those old promises. And in other words, it would cause us too much trouble. It'd be too messy. And it's clear from both our books we disagree with going with the mess.
Well, there's a tie also to reparations. As you know, New York State is looking at reparations, and I was asked about that recently. And I think it's a very hot button topic right now, especially with the divided country that we live in. But I think that the truth is that I live in Washington, D.C. I live in a neighborhood that was redlined. Black people were not allowed to buy houses in my neighborhood for many, many years. So, this sort of this injustice is continuing to some extent. I think there are forms of repair, and I'm not going to touch on the whole question of financial reparations, which maybe is my cop out, but I also think that there is repair in us writing these stories that haven't been told. And I think there's repair in acknowledging what the history actually includes, and the people who have been left out of the history, who are calling to us. They want their voices to be there. They want their stories to be told. So I feel very strongly that that is a form of repair. I noticed in New York State also, many museums are now starting to include much more acknowledgement of who else lived on this land, who else worked this land. And so I think that is an important part of repair too. But I think it's a question of, no, of course we can't change history, and no, of course we don't have to feel guilty about what our ancestors did. But I do think we have a responsibility to tell the story. What are you doing next? Are you writing another book about this, Susan?
I'm not sure. I'm still recovering. This was very painful for me in many ways. It was very difficult, and I still have trouble talking about it because my feelings are so deep and complicated, I think. But I do feel like there is a repair in just facing it, and I do think that it's just a beginning, really, for people to understand what happened in the place they grew up and begin to acknowledge it. So I do feel then that the story we tell as best we can from the place we're at, is a start.
I do think it's a start. I think it's, I think there are so many more stories. It's funny. I'll just mention that you said it's difficult and painful. I found it cathartic for me. I felt such a sense of relief to get this down on paper. And I said to my husband when I finished, don't let me ever do that again. And now I'm already thinking about something else I want to write, which I won't talk about now. But I feel this sense of relief that this at least is out there, and I hope it gets read. I hope both of our books get read. It's great to meet you face to face, also.
Yes, cousin.
Yes, cousin.
Yes.